Greetings. Welcome everyone to this webinar on emerging trends and methods in international development evaluation. My name is Laura Peck and I'm a principal scientist at Apt Associates in our Social and Economic Policy Division. And there I oversee evaluations of U.S. social welfare policies and programs. But I also have the opportunity to serve as our global lead for the Research, Monitoring, and Evaluation Capability Center. And what that means is that I have an opportunity to look across our portfolio of work globally to ensure that we are bringing the best of our capabilities to the world's challenges in support of our mission, which is to improve the quality of life and economic well-being to people worldwide. And so before we get started, I'd like to learn a little bit about you as well. And so I'm going to place in the chat a poll. It will take you outside of WebEx, but you'll stay here, don't worry, where you can answer 2 questions for us. And while you're doing that, I will share with you what the agenda is for the rest of the webinar. So first, Sebastian Lemire will present on emerging trends and methods that have relevance specifically to international development evaluation. And then 2 colleagues, experts in international development and M&E, will reflect on Sebastian's presentation from each of 2 perspectives. First, Betsy Ness-Edelstein will consider the implications from the perspective of U.S. funding agencies and interests. And then Lavinia Tyrell will consider implications from the perspective of Australian agencies and interests. So from there, we will hope to have a couple of questions that we can take from the audience that to address the issues that are of interest to you. So I'm going to pause for a moment then and ask Lauren, our trusted colleague who's running the technical things behind the scenes, to share the results of the poll. So this is really interesting. This is the second of this webinar that we're offering in a totally different time zone. And when we offered it yesterday, the majority of people were in the nonprofit sector, and today it looks like we have none. So a different audience, predominantly government. Welcome, we're really glad to have you. And then next question. How much do you know about evaluation? We've got no novices and no mega experts, but people who know a little bit and a lot. So my hope is that through the conversation and discussion, we can maybe move you further to the right on that scale. After you hear Sebastian's presentation, maybe some of you will think that you know everything now. Well, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to fill out those 2 questions for us. Also going to let you know that along the way, you are welcome to enter questions that you might have into the chat within WebEx. And to do that, you want to just be sure that you're directing them to all panelists, and then we'll see the questions. And like I said, we'll take a couple at the very end. And also, you can look to the chat for links that I'm going to post there. I will drop in on a particular subject. Links to additional resources that I hope you find of interest. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Sebastian.
Great, thank you, Laura. And how could we possibly have an evaluation event without some real-time data collection? Thanks to all the people joining today's conversation. It is a rainy and gray evening here in Washington, so it's just a perfect time to talk evaluation. We're going to dive right in. Over the past years, the range of evaluation approaches and designs and methods has grown substantially, and the evaluator toolbox just continues to grow. As a way of organizing my own thinking on the growing range of approaches and designs, I recently developed this metro map of evaluation. In part because my 5-year-old son just loves riding the metro, and I love evaluation, so here you go. The map consists of 3 main lines. There's a design line, a study design line. There's a theory line for theory-based evaluation approaches, which is where most of my work is situated. And there's a utilization line that has to do with evaluation use. Each of these dimensions are, of course, very central to evaluation as a practice and profession. There are also emerging lines And each station is labeled according to a specific approach or design or a method. And to the extent possible, I've tried to sort of put related approaches next to one another on the same line and sort of in proximity. When I say evaluation approaches, some people refer to those as evaluation theories or models. These are really approaches that prescribe how and with what purpose we conduct evaluation. So as just one example, we have theory-based evaluation, which prescribes that the evaluation should really be structured around and focused on the development and empirical refinement of a program theory. There are also study designs, and when I say study designs, I usually mean the overarching structure of the data collection. So do we include a control group or not? How do we place the measurement points before, during, or after the intervention, and so forth? So it really provides an overarching structure. And finally, methods refer to specific ways of collecting and analyzing data. So interviews, doing different kinds of statistical analyses would be under the rubric of methods. Now, there are, of course, many ways to develop these maps and many different lines and stations that could be included. I encourage you to adopt, adapt, or tailor it to your specific needs. It's a fun little exercise. And to be sure, this map is already incomplete, right? We will go on to discuss today, new lines and stations have already emerged. So let's go to the next slide, Lauren. Thank you. Now, it's of course an impossible task to cover all the trends and developments that are happening in evaluation. But I'll, for my talk today, focus on what I take to be the three major trends that are currently shaping our practice. And within each of these, I'll try to discuss what I take to be some interesting approaches and methods. And I'll also sort of try to suggest some things that I would like to see us focus on in the future. Now, by major trend, I basically mean a larger movement, a shift that reaches above and beyond evaluation, yet have significant impact on the practice and profession of evaluation. Throughout my talk, I'll be making references to this recently published methods guide by the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. I was fortunate enough to co-author this guide with evaluation rock stars Jos Varsen and Barbara Befani. The guide is really intended as sort of an introductory reference, accessible reference to a broad range of approaches and methods. And it's a really sort of neat guide to have access to, and a lot of the approaches and methods that I talk about today are described in the guide. So, the perfect read for like a Sunday morning, coffee in hand, the family is still sleeping, bring out the IAG methods guide. Best way to ease into a Sunday. So let's dive into the first trend, Lauren, if we go to the next slide. The first major trend that I would like to discuss is big data analytics. This is probably not a surprise to many of the people in the room. I think there are really two trends sort of happening here. One is the rapid growth in the availability and accessibility of information and communication technology, which has really opened up just a whole range of innovative avenue for data collection that can hold relevance to evaluation. And there are many benefits to potentially enlisting these technologies into our evaluations, including increasing the feasibility and reach of our data collection. We can expand our reach into remote areas. We can also get access to real-time or at least more readily updated data for analysis. Now, in extension of these emerging technologies, there's been a big push in terms of data science. So the integration of these large volumes of data, sometimes from multiple sources, sometimes unstructured, and using that through statistical modeling, machine learning, other techniques to identify patterns, associations in the data, and finding ways to summarize and visualize these patterns. I'm presenting here on the slide the Gartner hype cycle, which is depicted as a red line. The red line really illustrates sort of the different stages of hype surrounding the emergence of a new technology or something like big data analytics. In international development, I think the trigger for this trend was really in 2012 with the UN Global Pulse paper on big data and evaluation, the challenges and opportunities, and the keynote at the European Evaluation Society of that same year. And as I recall, evaluators were really divided. There was a lot of excitement, and there was also a lot of concern. You know, what is the implication for evaluation? Will we be replaced by data analysts? Is this a complete sort of replacement of all the traditional methods and approaches that we're using in evaluation? What about quality? What are the ethical implications? So there's a lot of mixed feelings. But I think since then, the influence of big data and has been less of a revolution and more of a slow movement. But I think what's happening now is that we're getting towards what Gartner, the hype cycle would say is a plateau of productivity. We're starting to see a lot of practical applications of both emerging technologies and big data analytics. And so we're starting to get to that point where we're seeing real world examples. And I think that's a very interesting, exciting moment to be in. And we actually have, as part of the methods guide book that we developed, we identified over 20 case applications that we list and describe in the guide. Let's go to the next slide, Lauren, thank you. Now, developing these real world examples are really important because they allow us to better appreciate the benefits and limitations of both emerging technologies and data analytics in the specific context of evaluation. The IEG at the World Bank recently developed this decision tree on whether to tap into alternative sources of evidence, such as big data. And I really think the questions around which the decision tree is structured are very worth considering. It's the kind of piece you want to sort of put on your refrigerator in your office. Always remind yourself to think about, is this something we should be pursuing? I think one of the biggest sort of things that have caught on and gained traction in evaluation is especially text mining and natural language processing. So I'm starting to see a lot of both webinars and actual case applications in this area. At Apt Associates, we recently, as part of responding to the COVID-19 crisis, we got access to a COVID-19 open research data set that included over 150,000 articles about COVID-19, SARS, and other related coronaviruses. And we were able to take a subset of over 50,000 of those and do some text mining and develop both some cross-cutting topics across this body of articles, but also a search engine allowing others to better access these articles. And this was done in less than 2 weeks. In less than 2 weeks, over 50,000 articles. So there's some real fantastic benefits to some of this work. But there are also challenges. So Lauren, let's go to the next one. As part of this text mining project here at Apt, we used a variety of cleaning methods to get the algorithms to analyze the words correctly. And that really gets at some of the challenges here. There can be a lot of subtle ambiguity in these types of text that can be difficult to capture. And as the data saurus reminds us, there's often more than one pattern or interpretation really that can match our statistical results and the data. And so we have to be very, very careful. And again, if we're not bringing attention to these types of issues, our models and analyses and interpretations really are vulnerable to bias and may even produce meaningless information. So I think in the future, and as lessons learned from real world examples are continuing to emerge, I suspect we'll see and hope we'll see increased attention to and techniques for remedying these types of issues, including how to reduce bias. Let's go to the next big trend that I'd like to talk about today, which is complexity. The second major trend really stems from this sustained interest among evaluators in explaining how and why interventions make a difference. Over the years, this interest in complexity has increasingly been framed in terms of evaluating complex programs in complex settings. I think we've made a lot of progress in terms of identifying what we mean by complexity. the different dimensions of a complexity to be considered in our evaluations. And we're now able to have a conversation about complexity in terms of the design of the intervention, the delivery, and the outcome, but also the context, of course, within which the intervention is embedded. And so I think we've sort of reached some shared conceptual clarity, though there's still work to be done for sure. But I think this is a really important trend and also a movement, because without unpacking this complexity in our evaluation of interventions, we will always struggle to sort of fully understand what's going on in an intervention, determine which aspects of it are working or not, and also understanding whether interventions are playing a positive causal role in bringing about expected change. Let's go to the next slide, Lauren. Thank you. From a methods perspective, the interest in capturing complexity has been particularly prevalent in theory-based evaluation and closely related realist evaluation. Both of these are evaluation approaches that revolve around examining the underlying theory of an intervention to explain how and why it generates a specific outcome of interest in a given context. Since the publication of realist evaluation by Pawson and Tilley in 1997, there's been a surge of published case applications. I recently did a review and found over 200 realist case applications and about 130 case applications of theory-based evaluations. And it was really interesting to me to sort of be able to review all of those and see what kind of methods and techniques people are using. And there's also growing interest there in concrete strategies and techniques and tools for getting at the complexity aspect of the evaluation. Also worth mentioning here is that last year, an entire issue of New Directions for Evaluation was dedicated entirely to the topic of causal mechanisms, which is focusing in large part on different ways of better understanding complex causal pathways and how to bring that into our evaluation work. Now let's go to the things I'd like to see more of. So over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of methodological development and application of both case-based, participatory, and systems-oriented approaches and methods. Each of these categories and individual approaches really offer different strategies for understanding and describing the underlying causal logic of interventions. If you're curious about the specific approaches that I highlight here, again, the IEG Methods Guide is a really good source. We cover most of these approaches and methods, and we provide description of their procedural steps, the benefits and limitations, applicability. We reference case applications and also both basic and advanced reading on the topic. So again, a good source for you. I know you'll just all be sitting there Sunday morning, coffee in hand now. I'm really selling it. But let's go to the next slide, Lauren, because there's some other things that I'd like to see more of in our practice that reaches beyond sort of what we have covered in the methods guide. How we model interventions really matter. As part of my own research of those 350 theory-based and realist evaluations, I came across a lot of innovative strategies and techniques for developing and testing theories of change or program theories, many of which are not really broadly used. So they're published and then made available, but they're not really gaining traction, wide traction among evaluators. Now, in the future, I would love to see more practical applications of both system mapping, such as causal loop diagrams. Have an example here. And I heard through the grapevine that there is another special issue of New Directions for Evaluation coming out that will focus just on practical examples of systems, methods, and complexity. Now, I would also love to see more consideration of the many different types of outcome trajectories that could be relevant for an intervention. We all too often, and I do this myself, design our data collection without proper attention to these outcome trajectories. And so when you really think about it, and I've done work on theory-based evaluations of market development programs for farmers, and it was pretty clear from the data collection, especially the qualitative aspects of the data collection, that the farmers were responding and had very different outcome trajectories in response to the program. But we really weren't able to capture that beyond the qualitative interviews and sort of get a sense of that what's happening. This, I think, is tremendously important. Another thing that think we'll see a lot more of is a component focus. I think very sort of traditional, we've been focused on looking at the intervention as a whole, as the program as a whole. I think we'll begin to focus less on the impact of whole interventions and increasingly on identifying the critical ingredients of interventions, the specific intervention components that either individually or in specific configurations are driving the observed change or the observed outcome. This is an area that I'm also doing a lot of work on right now at APT in the context of evidence reviews, but it also applies to individual evaluations. Let's go to the third and final trend, which is transformative change. Over the past years, I've noticed an increased sustained attention awarded to the role and purpose of evaluation in times of turbulence. I think this reflects an increased awareness in the profession of evaluation on the role of evaluation in response to these global economic crises like climate change in Europe, the humanitarian crisis and immigrants fleeing the South and coming to Europe. The theme for the upcoming European Evaluation Society conference is really revolves around uncertainty. And the conference was just earlier this week postponed until 2022 due to uncertainty. So I think it's just this big theme, not necessarily that the world is more chaotic or turbulent right now, but I think there's a more of a commitment in the practice and profession of evaluators to respond directly to that and to see our own role and purpose in relation to that. Now, there is, of course, a close connection between this awareness on transformational change and the previous trend on complexity and systems thinking. Evaluators now see themselves as part of a complex system, almost at the global level. I'll give you an example in just a little bit. I think this trend also signifies a renewed focus on the ethical dimension of evaluation and a commitment to transformative change in that way. The evaluator is no longer just an objective conveyor of information, but an active contributor to the design and implementation of evaluations, and of course also then a commitment to the results of that. Now that's not something that's entirely new. If we go to the next slide, we have a long history of working with different types of participatory evaluation approaches and even planning and management approaches. So it's not that it's coming out of nowhere. We've been doing adaptive management, developmental evaluation, utilization-focused evaluation, empowerment evaluation, rapid cycle evaluations. We're really sort of getting close to the program design and are really committed to this idea of continuous learning through evaluative activities. So it's not that it's coming completely out of the blue, but I think there is an important shift that I see now. If we go to the next slide. In 2019, Ideas published this excellent book on evaluation for transformational change, and each chapter proposes different ways for evaluation to be transformative. I think there's sort of an ethical component that's been added to this that I haven't seen as clearly articulated and as broadly committed to by evaluators as I see now. Over the next year, I think we'll see an increased focus on foresight. So not just being part of what's happening now or what happened in the past, but also trying to see how can we predict both the intended and unintended scenarios and consequences of the programs and interventions that we are evaluating. In a recent American Evaluation Association 365 post, these are daily posts that comes up that you can go in, and even if you're not a member, you can look these up. Julia Lin made this compelling case for including foresight into theory-based evaluation, these different foresight tools and techniques like scenario maps. I think this is a really interesting idea and certainly something I will be looking into. Others have proposed incorporating adverse consequences in our theories of change, which I think is also an idea worth pursuing. We tend to focus on the positive outcomes, but that could also be negative or adverse consequences coming out of an intervention or a program that we would want to be able to articulate as part of the theory of change. Finally, I think this question of are we doing good will be directed at the consequences of ourselves and our evaluations. Are we as evaluators doing more harm than good? I think this is a question that will come to the forefront as we move forward. And I know that right now there's a group of people at the Rockefeller Foundation, IAG, Rodney Hobson, U of I, that are working on this topic. So I'm very excited about their research on this. If you haven't heard of Blue Marble evaluation yet, I bet you will soon. Blue Marble is this global initiative spearheaded by Michael Patton, focusing on training the next generation of evaluators to think globally, act globally, and evaluate globally. So this goes back to this idea that I raised earlier about evaluators seeing themselves as part of the complexity in the system at the global level. Coming out from Michael Patton is, of course, rooted in utilization-focused evaluation, and it really focuses on systems thinking at the global level and transformation. So our ability to transform systems for a more sustainable and equitable future. It's a tall order, but I'm following this very closely. Now, what does this mean for the everyday evaluator just going about our business? Real world evaluation is very difficult. As we all know, a lot can happen in the space between the initial design of an evaluation and the actual implementation of the evaluation. Now, ideally, evaluation questions drive our methodological decisions. We might be informed by stakeholders to different degrees. We might be mixing methods and approaches in intelligent ways. And we'll be attending to context, of course. But at the end of the day, all of those decisions will be revolving around adapting our work to the real world constraints of budgets, time, data access, and just the plain old messiness of life. So in this way, quality evaluation is really less about rigor by design and more about rigor in thinking. How we respond and make the best of what we have in the specific context of an evaluation. Let's go to the next slide, Lauren. It is hard being an evaluator. When I initially started doing international development, we were doing monitoring and evaluation. And since then, the acronyms have just been growing longer and longer, more and more letters. And the role of the evaluator is just becoming increasingly complex. Most recently, USAID just announced the Merlin program. We are literally expected to be trained as wizards. It's the Harry Potter era of evaluation that we're entering here. And of course, this shift is not just semantics. It's a fundamental shift in the role and purpose of evaluators, individually and collectively. I use Thomas Swan's, and have been very inspired by Thomas Swan's book on Evaluation Foundations Revisited. Tom argues that competent evaluation really requires cultivating a life of the mind for practice. We need to reach beyond being good technicians to become reflective practitioners. And I agree. I think our evaluation should never be reduced to just a mere technical exercise with plug and play methods and approaches, ritualistic development of theories of change and performance indicators, and log frames without logic. Reflective practice involves equal parts situated judgment, critical thinking, and reflection, not just in methodological terms, but also in ethical terms. And it is exactly, I think, this type of reflective practice that will help us steer through the contextual uncertainties, the ambiguities of big data, the perplexities, the subtleties, and all the other limitations that we again will face in our practice. I think Swan's reflective practice provides a rich backdrop for the kind of dialogue that practitioners should now be engaging about the future of evaluation, of moving from rigor in design and towards rigor in thinking. So with that, I will pass on the mic.
Thank you, Sebastian. And as I mentioned yesterday, I know I'm not alone in wishing that I had a printed out version of that metro map. I'd like to keep it in my office. I think that's such a great visual. So I will talk a little bit about how these trends relate to what we currently see in the US funded international development space, and how we can best take advantage of them, and what are the challenges and opportunities in terms of the US international development space, which is complex in itself. So we have USAID, we have the Millennium Challenge Corporation, we have the State Department, we have the CDC, Department of Agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a lot of different agencies that are doing international development work of one type or another. Most of them have an evaluation policy that focuses on two main types of evaluation and defines impact evaluation or causal attribution and performance evaluation that looks to assess the performance of a project as the two main types. And most contracted evaluations really fall within one category or the other. Now, that's not to say that those are not compatible with some of these some of the new trends and some of the methods that Sebastian has been talking about. But I think it's really only at the edges in the US space that we're starting to see movement toward a dedicated, a dedicated approach to some newer methods. So Sebastian mentioned the Merlin contract that USAID created, that was created to basically co-fund the development of a number of new evaluation types. So rapid cycle evaluation is the one that APT has worked on. It also, excuse me, also funded the development of a developmental evaluation track, and one on evaluating complex systems, and a few others. And then there was also a global learning for adaptive management collaboration that USAID had with DFID. There's also a really big focus on CLA, collaborating, learning, and adapting, which is sort of USAID's branded approach to adaptive management. And I think we're seeing this slowly tick up, this focus, especially as systems thinking picks up steam on the program design and implementation side of things, because program designers in the US space are starting to think more from a systems perspective and a systems lens, and recognizing that tools for evaluation and monitoring need to get in stride with that. So for USAID in particular, which is by far the biggest funder of international development, with this enormous emphasis on CLA, and we're seeing develop over the past 5 or 10 years, there's also a real tension between wanting to promote real-time learning and evidence-driven adaptation on one side, and then on the other side, some real contractual realities that we see in not only USAID, but in general in US funded programs, where we may have standard indicators, we may have outcome targets that are contractually mandated, and that can mean that programs are really difficult to change while they're ongoing. And I think that what that leads to is adaptive management on a fairly small scale. So we may change a modality of how we're getting to a certain goal, but usually that goal is fixed in this context. And so it's interesting to think about how that model plays with a new set of methods that really, we're developing them because, not just for their own sake, but because we want to improve our programming. We want to improve accountability in all directions. And And so there is a little bit of a disconnect and some work, I think, that that we still need to do and push for to figure out how do we make these two sides work together and be compatible. Because on the other side, when we have standard indicators and when we have really fixed program targets, it makes it easy for us to roll up our impact across lots of different programs and report to Congress and say this is what we've done. And so, on the political side of things, that's also really important. I want to end with one additional thought that, at least in the US space, the independent evaluation piece of things and the adaptive management piece of things are separate. So usually a program itself and the implementer of that program are charged with monitoring and evaluation. They are the ones who would be doing any adaptive management, any ongoing learning. In most cases, an independent evaluator would be contracted separately, wouldn't be embedded with that program team, would be likely collecting separate data, not necessarily designing an evaluation along with the monitoring system or designing those two things as pieces of a whole, or even really informing each other sometimes. And so thinking about that siloing, there's a gap there. On the other hand, we also tend to value the independence of evaluators. So I think that's something that we need to navigate a little bit differently and think about how that separation is serving us and how it's not serving us. And how do we balance independence of evaluation, which is something that agencies and evaluators and consumers of evaluations really value, with the drawbacks to a more siloed approach, which is lack of understanding of implementation needs and realities on the part of an evaluator, a lack of connection with what's really happening on the ground, a disconnect between the evaluator and the project team, and on the data side, duplication of efforts and a lack of real harmonization of the kinds of data and the kinds of questions that we're answering. And then on the program side, maybe there's room for those teams to become more evaluative and less focused on reporting their mandated indicators that they have to compile every quarter and every year. But that can be challenging given scarcity of resources, which they're only becoming scarcer, older habits that we have about how things work, and staff capacity, because the project teams who do monitoring are trained and have experience doing that, but may not have the experience doing evaluation. So figuring out ways to make those things work together, so that we're able to take advantage of a lot of the newer ways of doing things is something that I think we and I personally am hoping to push forward. And I'm also really interested in how this connects to what Lavinia is about to talk about, because I think the US context and the Australian context seem to have very sort of complementary opportunities and challenges in a lot of ways. And I think there are things that we may be able to learn from each other. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Lavinia.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And I'll just ask, hi, I'm Lavinia. I'm the Head of Technical Delivery and Growth Strategy at APT Australia. And I'm going to ask my colleague if she wouldn't mind changing this slide to the wonderful, colourful map that Sebastian had up. Thank you. So I just wanted to talk about three things today, three areas where I think Sebastian and Betsy's comments really intersect with some key trends in the Australian aid context. So the first is the value in resourcing for M&E and evaluation in the aid program. The second is adaptive management, and the third is localisation and inclusion. So on the first one, the value in resourcing for evaluation in Australian aid, I think for those of us who've been working for some time in Australia and the region, we've seen a fairly sort of steady devolution of evaluation and M&E functions more broadly from a central level in Australian aid to out to posts, so those officers working in country, and a sort of gradual decline in the resourcing and focus of M&E and evaluative processes as standardised across the Australian aid program. And that's been typified by the dismantling of the Office of Development Effectiveness, and also the shift away from aid technical to sort of policy generalist skills, which really follow the shift in the department that used to be AusAid over to the integration of aid into foreign affairs. I think this has two real implications for those of us working on projects at the front line. It means there's a far greater pressure on Australian aid officials, national and local staff in country, to be commissioning and overseeing and quality assuring M&E processes. It's also meant a far greater reliance on implementing partners, so managing contractors, NGOs, occasionally partner governments, CSOs, to be able to have strong M&E capabilities in-house. So for me, one of the things that struck me from Sebastian's presentation was it highlights that there is a real need for a much greater literacy amongst those of us overseeing and delivering the aid program in country in core M&E competencies and standards. So that doesn't mean everyone needs to be an expert in evaluative techniques and processes, but we need to be able to make the case for why it's important to invest in these processes, what the value is in aid effectiveness and achieving results for Australian taxpayer dollars. Also the value in learning and improving programs as we're implementing them. And being able to know when to call in particular expertise or how to resource programs, so that if we're not specialists in evaluation, we know when to draw on the types of resources and what we want from those resources in our aid programs. There's a second really interesting issue raised by both Sebastian and Betsy on adaptive management. So in Australia, again, we've seen over the past couple of years a much greater focus on adaptive delivery at the design and tendering of major new Australian government projects, for example, the PNG Transition to Health program in Papua New Guinea. It's also a focus of the Partnerships for Recovery policy document Australia has in the Pacific. So adaptive management relies on an emergent model for change. It assumes that that relationship between cause and effect will only become clear once you start implementing. So you might have an idea of where you want to get to, your goal, but you're not quite sure how to get there. You're going to have to test different strategies, different modalities, different theories of change, and make small bets and adjust as you go in response to what you're learning in context. So this has several implications for evaluation theory and practice. The first is adaptive programs, at least in our experience, require a much heavier emphasis on that top left-hand corner of Sebastian's diagram. So a much heavier emphasis on sort of most significant change, outcome harvesting, outcome mapping techniques. So approaches which are able to sort of grapple with and capture this complexity, to look at multiple causal pathways to change, to think about unintended consequences, not just evaluating change against a sort of predetermined plan. Adaptive management, and Sebastian picked up on this as well, also really requires us to think hard about what mixed methods approaches are useful. So not just, so methods that allow us to look at the what, so the accountability side, but also allow us to think about how and why did change come about? Why did the program adjust and adapt as it did? Why did it look different in year 3 to what it did in year 2? And to unpack and explain some of those factors to both donors and partners in country. Adaptive management also really relies on getting information in as close to real time as possible, because that information allows programs to make decisions about activities to drop, activities to add, where to put funding, how to adjust partnerships and grant agreements, and so on. So processes like rapid cycle evaluation and action research become particularly relevant for adaptive programs because they're methods that can provide data in really timely, usable forms to those at the front line delivering adaptive programs. I think adaptive management also provides an interesting challenge for those of us in M&E because it places a high value on tacit forms of knowledge. So by this I mean the political insights which our national staff bring, particularly community knowledge, contextual and cultural knowledge, storytelling, etc. Sometimes in evaluative and M&E processes, there's a bit of a divide between what's seen as sort of sufficient evidence to make decisions and changes to programs and what's seen as insufficient. So sometimes sufficient is equated with scientific or westernised or sort of externally validated forms of knowledge, whereas adaptive management really challenges us to think about how do we also give credit to those tacit forms of knowledge as a legitimate reason to make changes to programming as we go. The last thing I wanted to touch on was localisation and gender and inclusion. So DFAT, as I'm sure many of you know, the Australian government has committed to integrating gender and inclusion across the aid program cycle, and also promoting local leadership in the aid program, particularly in the Pacific. Ultimately, both of these processes are about power. And I think, again, this diagram that Sebastian's put up offers us in Australian aid some really practical ways to progress these agendas with and on behalf of the Australian government. I think the first thing to recognise is that the process of evaluation is a political act. It does involve some form of power. So then looking at the bottom left-hand side of Sebastian's diagram, these methods offer some really practical ways to try and shift evaluative practice away from an extractive exercise to one which also supports inclusion and empowerment. So those methods such as participatory, utilisation focused, empowerment focused evaluation all challenge and offer us ways to think about how do we put local actors, a good mix of local actors in positions where they can shape the focus and intent of evaluative processes. So the questions we're asking, who it's for, the types of lines of inquiry we want to use. It also challenges us to think about the rhetoric of who has expertise to undertake evaluation. To think about who's in our evaluation team, whose views do they represent? How inclusive is it, both in an international and national sense, but also across the spectrum of different stakeholders in a particular country? And of course, through that process of collecting data, making sense of data, there's real opportunities to think about whose views are being represented, whose views aren't being represented, and how do we address that in the evaluative process. And of course, sense making of data and the development of recommendations through evaluation. So there's oftentimes a tendency for that to be quite a sort of closed and extractive process. Information's taken and looked at by a small number of often international and donor counterparts. But there are some really good ways to sort of open that up and make that a much more collaborative process of making sense of information and to tailoring findings and recommendations to the beneficiaries or the users, the people being affected by the program, rather than just always focused on the accountability side of things. And I just wanted to finish by mentioning that in the Pacific, there are a number of really brilliant Pacific-led approaches to M&E that people can look at if they're interested in this. So there was some work done by the SPC, a document called REBLIP, it draws on a metaphor from Marshall Islands about navigation, and it's a Pacific-developed, Pacific-owned way about thinking about what M&E means to Pacific Islanders. And then there are a range of methods which I'm sure people may be familiar with, such as Talanoa, which are locally led, culturally appropriate ways of reflecting on change, of bringing people together to tell stories about their realities, what change means for them. And there are ways to integrate that into M&E processes. So that is all from me. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today, and I look forward to the questions and discussions.
Thank you. Well, we want to also circle this back to the audience. And so while you think of other questions that you might pose for us to discuss, we have 3 questions for you that, if you're willing, you can respond in the chat, numbering them 1, 2, 3, and let us know what you think is the most important trend among those that we've discussed. And if you think that we have missed any trends, by all means, we would love to hear what you think are important trends in evaluation, in international development evaluation, that we haven't addressed yet. And then also thinking about what you'd like for the future. I mean, I know that for Lavinia, it's already Friday, where I am, it's still Thursday. So she has a little bit of insight into the future, more so than I do. But we would like to hear from you. What topics would you like us to address in a future webinar? So you can answer those questions in the chat for us, and we'll process them after the webinar. But you can also pose questions to us where we can delve in our remaining few minutes together to be sure that we're discussing topics that, that you find important.
Laura, there was one question here that came about how causality is an important aspect for evaluations.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good one to start with, maybe?
And particularly with respect to, with respect to COVID, I had put a couple of resources in the chat related to that in particular, but Sebastian, I'd love to hear you and Betsy and Lavinia share some thoughts on that topic, please.
And so this is coming out of an observation that too often we focus too much on what works and what doesn't work, which I think is very common. And evaluation in its modern form here in US really comes out of these large-scale RCTs and quasi-experimental designs of demonstration projects during the Great Society year. So there is that sort of tradition. I think coming at it with this rigor and thinking approach, I think there are really 3 ways to reach beyond that what works question. One is to think about I think there are 4 ways that you can really describe causal relationships. There's the counterfactual approach, where you're using a control group or comparison group, and you're really able to determine sort of the least biased net effect estimate, which is very powerful. It's a powerful design. It answers some very good questions that we entertain in evaluation. Another strategy is probabilistic. So this is where you use regression analyses to try to maybe dive in and see if there are specific factors that are influencing the outcome of interest. Some of the techniques and approaches that I showed today are configurational. So qualitative comparative analysis is it's really coming out of the case-based tradition. And you're looking at, are there specific configurations of intervention components that are driving the outcome? And finally, there are these sort of causal pathway or mechanism-based approaches, where you're trying to really describe the causal pathways between the intervention and the outcome. And this is where you're trying to describe and explain how and why the outcome came out. I think from a rigor in thinking perspective, the extent to which you can combine 2 or more of these approaches in an evaluation is really powerful. So that you do a theory-based impact evaluation using a counterfactual design combined with a theory of change or QCA analysis. I think another area if you're trying to sort of advance your impact evaluation is to reach some conceptual clarity. When I reviewed hundreds of realist evaluations, there are lots of different interpretations of what a mechanism is. And I think being clear in your key concepts is part of sort of rigor in thinking, being very explicit about what you mean by the terms, the key terms in your evaluation. And finally, I think rigor in thinking should also, and if you want to advance your impact evaluation practices, the analytical strategies that you're using. I came across so many interesting ways of analyzing data and bringing it back into supporting a conversation or a story about how and why the program makes a difference. Just one example from qualitative interviewing is causation coding. That comes from Johnny Saldana. And it's a coding technique that allows you and facilitates you going into interview transcripts and coding the causal statements that are made by the program participants. Small things like that, that just brings you away from the classic sort of thematic coding and adds a little bit of more systematic and transparency to your coding.
Yeah, and I think that, Sebastian, we're getting calls for whether your map is published somewhere, so I'll let you answer that in just a moment. But what I think that your subway map highlights to us is that there are lots of lines and stops and connections, and I will actually quote my colleague Mbuso, who works out of our London office, and he said, we need to master the science of mixing methods to capture the complexity of programs in our evaluations. And so I think that even though my own personal expertise is in causal impact evaluation, that is one flavor, that is one stop in that whole metro map. And I think that you and Mbuso are accurate in reflecting on that we need to figure out how to take match the way that we generate answers to the questions that we're asking, and be creative in how we mix methods to be sure that we're getting the richest information possible to answer those questions. There's also another question in the chat if you want to look at it about behavioral science. And I'm not sure among us who's the right one to take that on, but definitely have other apt colleagues who are expert in that. Does anyone on the panel want to make an attempt at answering that from your perspective?
I'd like to offer a pretty unqualified opinion, but I think what you're getting at is interesting because first of all, I think some of the methods that Sebastian touched on, utilization-focused evaluation, developmental evaluation, do really center the uptake of evaluation results. And I think to touch back on some of Lavinia's points, who owns those results and who decided that those are the results that are worth evaluating for, what evaluation is in the first place, and who kind of has ownership of those concepts, or how we agree on those. I think that there's a lot to be said for just how we center all of those concepts.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not the first one to make the observation that the word value is smack dab in the middle of evaluation. And so on that point, we are now at the top of the hour, whichever hour that is for you. I'm so grateful that you joined us in this conversation, and we look forward to following up with you and continuing this conversation. Thanks for being here.